The buzzard circling overhead should have been Corbin's first warning, but he'd grown numb to death in the desert. 3 months of wandering the wastelands between civilization had taught him that carrion birds were as common as tumbleweeds. What made him pause his weathered gelding wasn't the birds. It was the sound that cut through the desert silence, like a blade through canvas. A whinny. High-pitched, desperate, and unmistakably young, Corbin Thorne had been many things in his 47 years. Soldier, gambler, cattle driver, and most recently, a man with nothing left to lose. The war had taken his family, drought had claimed his ranch, and creditors had seized what remained. Now he drifted through the territories with little more than his horse, his Colt 45, and a growing indifference to his own survival. But that sound, that plaintive cry echoing off the Red Canyon walls, stirred something in him he'd thought, buried with his wife and children. Following the sound down a narrow arroyo, Corbin found the source. A colt, no more than 3 months old, stood beside the bloated carcass of what had once been a magnificent Mustang mare. The foal's ribs showed through his dusty coat, and his legs trembled with exhaustion, but his dark eyes burned with a fierce will to live that reminded Corbin painfully of his youngest son. "Easy there, little one," Corbin murmured, dismounting slowly. The colt backed away, but not far. He was too weak to run, and perhaps some instinct told him this stranger meant no harm. The mare had been shot, a single bullet wound behind her. Shoulder suggested it hadn't been random violence, but a mercy killing. Someone had tried to put her out of her misery, but they'd left her foal to starve. Corbin's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough cruelty in the war, enough callousness in its aftermath, but abandoning a defenseless animal still made his blood simmer. Water was precious in the desert, but Corbin poured some from his canteen into his hat and offered it to the colt. The young horse approached cautiously, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of life-giving moisture. When he finally lowered his head to drink, Corbin felt something crack open inside his chest. A feeling he'd tried to kill with whiskey and distance. "Reckon you're an orphan too," he said quietly, watching the colt drain every drop. "Question is, what do we do about it?" The sensible thing would be to put the animal out of its misery and continue on his aimless journey. But as Corbin looked into those dark, intelligent eyes, he saw something that made him pause. This wasn't just any wild Mustang colt. The mare's bloodline was clear in his noble head, his strong hindquarters, his perfectly proportioned legs. Even starving and scared, he carried himself with an innate grace that spoke of generations of wild freedom. "You're something special, aren't you?" Corbin whispered, extending his hand. The colt sniffed his fingers, then allowed the gentlest of touches on his dusty muzzle. That simple contact changed everything. For the first time in months, Corbin felt a purpose beyond mere survival. Here was a life that needed saving, a spirit that deserved a chance to run free across the endless desert. Here was hope on 4 legs. The desert wind picked up, swirling dust around them as if the land itself was holding its breath. Neither man nor colt knew it yet, but this moment would echo through the years, becoming the foundation of a legend that would outlive them both. Naming the colt proved easier than expected. As Corbin fashioned a makeshift halter from his spare rope, the young horse showed an immediate fascination with anything that glinted in the sunlight. His belt buckle, the brass fittings on his saddle, even the polished barrel of his revolver. When a piece of mica caught the light and the colt actually tried to bite it, Corbin chuckled for the first time in months. "Flint it is, then. You've got a taste for shiny things, don't you, boy?" The journey back to civilization became a test of patience and ingenuity. Flint was too weak to travel far, forcing Corbin to make camp every few miles. But the colt's spirit proved stronger than his body. Each day he grew a little steadier on his legs, a little more trusting of the grizzled drifter who shared his meager rations and precious water. Corbin found himself talking to the horse, really talking, not just the idle chatter men make to animals. He told Flint about the ranch he'd lost, about Margaret and the children, about the dreams that had died in Missouri mud and desert dust. The colt would cock his head and listen with an intensity that made Corbin wonder if horses understood more than men gave them credit for. On the fourth day, they encountered their first test. A rattlesnake, coiled and ready to strike, blocked their path through a narrow canyon pass. Corbin's horse shied away, but Flint, despite his youth and inexperience, stepped forward with ears pricked, studying the serpent with curious intelligence rather than fear. "No, boy," Corbin said firmly, but Flint had already figured out the puzzle. The colt moved in a wide circle around the snake, never taking his eyes off it, demonstrating an awareness of danger that seemed beyond his months. That evening, as they camped beside a muddy waterhole, Corbin realized something remarkable was happening. He was healing, not the wounds on his body, those had closed months ago, but the deeper injuries to his spirit. Caring for Flint gave him a reason to wake up each morning, a purpose beyond the bottle and the endless, meaningless miles. The colt was changing too. Good feed and regular water were working their magic, but it was more than physical recovery. Flint began to play, bucking and spinning in circles around their camp, chasing insects, or simply running for the joy of movement. His coat took on a lustrous sheen, revealing itself to be a deep chestnut with 4 white socks, and a blaze down his face that looked like a lightning bolt. On the 7th day, they reached the settlement of Perdition Creek, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a trading post that served travelers heading west. Corbin had planned to rest, resupply, and continue on, but Flint had other ideas. The moment they entered town, the colt transformed. His head came up, his step quickened, and he began to prance like he owned every grain of sand beneath his hooves. Children gathered to stare at the beautiful young horse, and their delight seemed to energize Flint even more. "That's some colt. You got there, stranger?" said Brewster Mills, the trading post owner, stepping out to admire the horse. "Don't see many Mustangs with that kind of presence. Where'd you find him?" As Corbin told the story, a crowd gathered. There was something about the tale, the abandoned colt, the unlikely rescue, the bond between man and horse, that caught people's imagination. Before long, half the town had turned out to see Flint, who basked in the attention like he'd been born to it. That night, as Corbin made camp on the outskirts of town, he found himself facing a decision he hadn't expected. Perdition Creek wasn't much, but it was civilization. It was safety. It was a place where a man could start over and where a special horse might find his destiny. For the first time since leaving his burned ranch, Corbin began to think about tomorrow instead of just surviving today. Word of the desert rescue spread through Perdition Creek like wildfire. By the second morning, people were making excuses to walk past Corbin's makeshift camp just to catch another glimpse of Flint. The colt seemed to understand his newfound celebrity status, arching his neck and showing off whenever visitors approached. Valencio Rodriguez, the town's unofficial horse expert, arrived with the sunrise. A former cavalry sergeant with hands gentled by decades of working with difficult mounts, he studied Flint with the eye of a true horseman. "This one's got the bloodline," he announced after a thorough examination. "See the slope of that shoulder? The depth of chest? His mama came from champion stock, no doubt about it." He ran weathered fingers along Flint's neck. "But it's more than breeding. This horse has something you can't put into words. Heart," said Corbin simply. "Heart, yes, but also intelligence. Watch his eyes. He's always thinking, always learning. In my country, we would say he has alma, soul." Valencio's assessment proved prophetic. Over the following days, Flint demonstrated an uncanny ability to read people and situations. When cranky old Jeremiah Gust approached with his walking stick raised, intending to shoo the horse away from his vegetables, Flint simply stood still and nickered softly. The old man's irritation melted away, and within minutes he was hand-feeding the colt carrots from his garden. Children were drawn to Flint like metal filings to a magnet. He seemed to know instinctively how to behave around them, gentle as a lamb with the smallest tots, playful but careful with the older ones. When 5-year-old Delilah Patch fell and scraped her knee near his grazing area, Flint walked over and nuzzled her tears away. somehow knowing exactly the comfort she needed. But it was Flint's response to danger that truly set him apart. When a dust storm roared in from the west, most animals sought shelter and waited it out. Flint positioned himself upwind of the town's livestock, using his body to break the worst of the wind and sand. When coyotes prowled too close to the settlement, one night he didn't flee. He placed himself between the predators and the town, calling out a warning that woke the night watchman. "Never seen anything like it," admitted Town Sheriff Boone Cartwright, a man not given to easy wonder. "It's like that horse thinks he's responsible for protecting this place." The revelation came during the third week of their stay. A traveling preacher named Reverend Polk arrived in town, and with him came troubling news. Cattle rustlers had been working the territory, hitting small ranches and driving stolen herds toward the Mexican border. They were led by a man called Iron Jack Mullins, known for his cruelty and his distinctive black Mustang stallion. "Saw that horse of his myself," Polk told the gathered crowd. "Beautiful animal, but mean as a sidewinder. Kicks and bites anyone. Who ain't his master? Iron Jack takes pride in riding a horse that can't be tamed by anyone else." Corbin felt a chill run down his spine. He'd heard of Iron Jack, and the description of the black stallion stirred uncomfortable memories. That night he studied Flint more carefully, noting details he'd overlooked before. The perfect conformation, the intelligent eyes, the natural leadership quality that made other horses defer to him despite his youth. "Your daddy was something special, wasn't he, boy?" he murmured, stroking Flint's neck. "Something worth stealing." The pieces fell together like a puzzle, solving itself. The mare they'd found hadn't been shot randomly. She'd been part of a stolen herd. When she'd grown, too weak to travel, probably foaling on the trail. Iron Jack's men had put her down rather than slow their escape. But they'd overlooked the Colt, or maybe assumed he'd die on his own. They'd been wrong on both counts. Flint wasn't just any Mustang. He was the son of Iron Jack's prized stallion, heir to a bloodline that ran back to the Spanish conquistadors. He carried the genes of centuries of desert warriors, horses that had carried riders across impossible distances and through unimaginable hardships. As if sensing Corbin's thoughts, Flint raised his head and looked toward the western mountains, where the outlaws were said to hide. His nostrils flared, and for a moment something wild and magnificent blazed in his dark eyes. Not fear, but recognition. Challenge. Destiny calling across the desert wind. The raid came at dawn on a Tuesday, when most of Perdition Creek still slept beneath wool blankets and fading dreams. Iron Jack Mullins rode at the head of 6 men, their horses' hooves drumming a deadly rhythm on the hardpan earth. They'd come for supplies and whatever money the trading post might hold. But Iron Jack's pale eyes were scanning for something else entirely. He found it grazing peacefully behind Brewster Mills's store. "Well, I'll be damned," Iron Jack breathed, reining in his black stallion. The resemblance between the two horses was unmistakable now. The same noble head, the same powerful build, the same aura of barely contained wildness. Look what crawled out of the desert to find its daddy. Corbin heard the commotion from his camp and arrived to find the outlaws surrounding Flint. The Colt stood perfectly still, not from fear but from a kind of regal composure that made him seem larger than his actual size. His dark eyes never left the black stallion, and something passed between them. Recognition, challenge, perhaps even sadness. "That's my horse you're looking at," Corbin said quietly, his hand resting casually near his gun. Iron Jack laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Your horse? Friend, that Colt's got my brand burned into his bloodline, sired by the finest stallion in 3 territories." He gestured to the black horse beneath him. "Diablo here don't make ordinary foals. That little beauty belongs with his own kind." "His kind is right here," Corbin replied, "with people who care about him." The standoff might have ended in gunfire, but Flint had other ideas. The young horse stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Corbin and the outlaws. His message was clear. Whatever happened next, they'd have to go through him first. Diablo whinnied, a sound that combined greeting, warning, and something deeper. Flint answered with a call of his own. higher in pitch but no less commanding. The conversation between father and son needed no translation. They were magnificent together, these horses of the desert, and for a moment even Iron Jack seemed reluctant to break the spell. "Tell you what, stranger," the outlaw said finally. "I'm feeling generous today. That colt's worth maybe $50 to you, but he's worth 10 times that to me. I'll give you $100 for him, right here, right now. He's not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. 200. No." Iron Jack's face darkened. "Then maybe I'll just take him. What's one saddle tramp going to do against 6 armed men?" That's when Sheriff Cartwright appeared, shotgun in hand and badge gleaming in the morning sun. Behind him came Valencio, Brewster Mills, and half a dozen other townsmen, all armed and ready for trouble. "Seems to me you're outnumbered, Jack," Cartwright said calmly. "Maybe you should reconsider your business here." The outlaw's eyes flicked between the armed citizens and Flint, calculating odds and options. His men shifted nervously in their saddles, fingers hovering near gun butts. The town held its collective breath. Then Flint did something extraordinary. He walked directly to Iron Jack's horse, close enough to touch noses with his sire. Diablo nickered softly, and Flint responded in kind. But when Iron Jack reached down to grab the colt's mane, Flint stepped back and shook his head, not in fear, but in clear refusal. "Looks like he's made his choice," Corbin said quietly. Iron Jack's face went through several shades of anger before settling on cold fury. "This ain't over," he promised. "That colt's got my blood in him, and blood calls to blood. He'll come. To me eventually, one way or another." As the outlaws rode out of town, trailing dust and threats, Flint returned to Corbin's side. But something had changed in the young horse's bearing. He stood taller, walked with more purpose, and his eyes held a new awareness of his own power and destiny. The confrontation had awakened something in him, not just the knowledge of his heritage, but the understanding that he was no ordinary horse. He was the son of legends, heir to the wild freedom of the desert, yet he had chosen civilization and the love of good people over the dark magnificence of his sire's world. That choice would define everything that followed. 3 weeks. After Iron Jack's visit, Flint began to change in ways that went beyond his rapidly maturing body. The playful colt was evolving into something more complex, part guardian, part performer, part living symbol of the untamed spirit that had built the West. The townspeople of Perdition Creek watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and unease, sensing they were witnessing something rare and possibly dangerous. The first sign came when drought threatened the settlement's water supply. The creek that gave the town its name dwindled to a muddy trickle, and the well at the trading post began to run dry. Men talked of abandoning Perdition Creek, of moving on to greener pastures before the desert claimed another failed settlement. But Flint had other ideas. On a scorching afternoon when the sun turned the air to liquid fire, the young horse began to pace restlessly around the town's perimeter. His behavior puzzled everyone until Valencio recognized the signs. "He's following water," the old horseman explained to the gathered crowd. "Desert horses can smell it from miles away. My grandfather told me stories of horses that could find springs no man could locate." Flint's pacing grew more purposeful, and eventually he set off toward the eastern hills with determined strides. Corbin followed, along with a small group of increasingly desperate townspeople. They walked for 2 hours through landscape that seemed incapable of supporting life, following a horse who moved with absolute certainty toward some unseen goal. They found it in a box canyon hidden behind a wall of red rock, a natural spring bubbling up from deep underground, creating a small oasis of green grass and clear water. The spring was ancient, probably used by indigenous peoples for generations, but somehow forgotten by the current inhabitants of the region. "How did he know?" whispered Delilah Patch, now old enough to understand the miracle she was witnessing. Corbin had no answer, but he was beginning to suspect that Flint possessed instincts and abilities that went far beyond normal horse intelligence. The drought had been their first real test, and Flint had passed with flying colors. The second test came in the form of fire, A lightning strike ignited the dry grass south of town, and within hours a wildfire was racing toward Perdition Creek. With the speed and hunger of a living thing, the wind pushed walls of flame across the desert, consuming everything in their path. Evacuation seemed the only option until Flint demonstrated another impossible ability. Instead of fleeing from the fire like every sensible creature, he positioned himself at the leading edge of the flames and began to run parallel to them. His path seemed random at first, but gradually a pattern emerged. He was creating fire breaks, areas where the flames would find less fuel and lose momentum. More incredibly, he seemed to understand wind patterns, anticipating where the fire would turn and heading it off at crucial points. Working alongside the horse, the townspeople managed to create barriers that channeled the fire around their settlement. It was exhausting, dangerous work, but somehow Flint always knew where the next threat would come from. By dawn, Perdition Creek stood intact while miles of surrounding desert lay blackened and smoldering. "That horse saved our town," Sheriff Cartwright said simply, and no one disagreed, but the greatest test was yet to come. Iron Jack returned in late autumn, bringing more men and a hunger for revenge that had festered through the long summer months. This time he didn't ride into town making demands. He set up camp in the hills and began a siege of terror, picking off isolated ranchers and travelers, slowly tightening the noose around Perdition Creek. "He's not after supplies this time," Valencio observed grimly. "He wants that horse and he means to have him." The attacks escalated. Supply wagons were ambushed, cattle were stolen, and anyone who ventured too far from town risked disappearing. Forever. Fear settled over Perdition Creek like a shroud, and people began to whisper that maybe they should give Iron Jack what he wanted. Flint seemed to sense the growing tension. He spent his days on high ground overlooking the town, scanning the horizon like a sentinel. His behavior grew increasingly restless, and Corbin began to worry that the young horse was planning something dangerous. The worry proved justified when Flint disappeared one moonless night, leaving behind only hoofprints heading west toward the outlaw camp. By the time Corbin discovered he was gone, the sun was already painting the eastern sky pink, and somewhere in the distance, a horse was screaming in rage and challenge. The final confrontation had begun. The sound that echoed across the desert that morning was unlike anything the people of Perdition Creek had ever heard. The battle cry of two stallions claiming the same territory, the same bloodline, the same right to rule the wild spaces between civilization and chaos. Corbin rode hard toward the sound, his heart hammering with fear for the young horse who had become his reason for living. He found them in a natural amphitheater of red stone, father and son circling each other with the deadly grace of born warriors. Diablo was larger, older, scarred by years of violence and hardship, but Flint had youth, intelligence, and something his sire lacked, the love and trust of good people burning in his heart like an inner fire. Iron Jack and his men formed a circle around the fighting horses, whooping and placing bets on the outcome. They saw it as entertainment, but Corbin understood the deeper truth. This wasn't just a fight between animals, it was a battle for the soul of the West itself, between the old ways of taking what you wanted by force and the new possibility of building something better through cooperation and mutual respect. The horses reared and struck, their hooves ringing against stone like hammer blows. Diablo fought with savage fury, but Flint fought with purpose. Every move he made seemed calculated, designed not just to defeat his opponent but to prove something larger about the kind of horse and the kind of future he represented. The tide turned when Flint did something unprecedented. Instead of meeting Diablo's charge head-on, he sidestepped and used the black stallion's momentum against him, sending him stumbling into the canyon wall. It was a move that required not just athletic ability but strategic thinking, the kind of intelligence that separated great horses from merely strong ones. Diablo recovered quickly, but something had changed. He looked at his son with new respect, and perhaps even a grudging pride. When Flint called out again, not in challenge this time but in invitation, the black stallion's response was different. Softer, almost wondering. "What the hell, Iron?" Jack muttered. his entertainment turning into something he didn't understand. That's when the rest of the town arrived. Sheriff Cartwright, Valencio, Brewster Mills, and 24 other citizens who had refused to let Corbin face this alone. The outlaws found themselves surrounded by determined people with rifles and the kind of quiet courage that built settlements in impossible places. But the real surprise came from Diablo himself. The great black stallion looked between his son, and the assembled townspeople seemed to weigh something in his mind, then made a choice that stunned everyone. He walked calmly to Iron Jack's side and refused to let his master mount. "What are you doing, you stupid beast?" Iron Jack snarled, raising his whip. The whip never fell. Diablo's teeth closed on the outlaw's wrist with enough force to break bone, and Iron Jack screamed as he was lifted off his feet and shaken like a rag doll. When the stallion finally released him, the outlaw leader collapsed in the dust, clutching his mangled arm and staring in disbelief at the horse who had served him faithfully for years. Flint approached his sire slowly, respectfully, and the two horses touched noses in a moment of perfect understanding. Whatever passed between them in that instant, it changed everything. Diablo turned and galloped away into the deep desert, not in defeat, but in acceptance of a new order. His son had proven himself worthy, and the old king was ready to abdicate his throne. Iron Jack and his remaining men were taken into custody without further resistance. The outlaw leader kept muttering about his horse's betrayal, unable to comprehend. That respect earned through fear is never truly respect at all. In the years that followed, the story of Flint grew into legend. He became the unofficial guardian of Perdition Creek, and his presence drew visitors from across the territory who wanted to see the horse that had saved a town and tamed the desert itself. The settlement prospered, eventually becoming the thriving City of Perdition, and Flint's descendants carried on his legacy of intelligence, courage, and loyalty. Corbin lived to be 83, spending his final decades as the town's beloved storyteller, sharing tales of the desert rescue that had changed both their lives. When he died peacefully in his sleep, Flint, now an ancient but still magnificent stallion, stood vigil beside his grave for 3 days and nights, before finally accepting that his oldest friend had gone to a place where even the greatest horses couldn't follow. The bronze statue that stands in Perdition's town square today depicts a man and a horse side by side, facing west toward the endless desert. The inscription reads simply, "Corbin Thorn and Flint, who found each other when both were lost." But the old-timers who remember the real story know the truth is both simpler and more complex than any statue can convey. It's about second chances, about the bonds that form between broken souls, and about the way love can transform the most unlikely creatures into legends that outlive the desert wind itself. Every sunset, when the light turns the western sky to gold and crimson, visitors to Perdition still claim they can hear it, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls, as eternal and unstoppable as the land that forged them both.